Hi, welcome to this Blender video tutorial entitled Blender Materials Shaders. One of the most important sets of material controls in Blender are the shader controls. A shader is a set of software instructions that calculates the rendering effect of the scene as seen through the camera's viewing plane based on the lighting present in the scene. To demonstrate the shader controls, I've placed a smooth UV sphere into my Blender scene. The UV sphere has a medium blue material linked to it. I'm using the default camera and the default lamp. I'm going to split my 3D display viewport vertically. In the Render Context panel, I'll set the Render Display to the Image Editor, and then I'll change the right 3D viewport to the UV Image Editor. Now when I render the scene by pressing F12, it will render within the UV Editor viewport. I'll select the UV sphere and click on the Materials Context button in the Properties panel. Here are the controls for the blue medium material currently linked to the sphere's mesh. Directly below the Preview panel are Blender's two shader controls, Diffuse and Specular. If you look closely at the rendered sphere, you can see the two areas of influence associated with the two Blender shader controls. The diffuse shader controls the general color of the sphere based on its relationship to the light source, displaying a smooth fall-off from bright to dark from the point of strongest illumination to the point of darkest shadow. The specular shader controls the brighter highlights that one sees reflected from a glossy surface, mimicking the reflection of the light source itself. As such, specular reflection is highly dependent on the position of the camera in relationship to the light source. If we click on the Diffuse Shader Type button, we see that Blender provides 5 choices for diffuse shading: Lambert, Oren-Nayar, Toon, Minart, and Fresnel. For now, I'm going to turn down the intensity effect of the specular shader so that we can focus on the effect produced by the diffuse shader. I'll re-render the scene. Note that the specular reflection is no longer displayed on the sphere. Lambert is the default diffuse shader. This is a very good all-purpose diffuse shader. It, like all of the diffuse and specular shaders, have a major control setting called intensity. The intensity controller controls the brightness of the diffused color. The higher the setting, the brighter the diffused color, simulating more diffuse light reflection. And the lower the setting, the darker the diffuse color, simulating less diffuse lighting reflection. I'll set the intensity back to the default 0.8. The Oren-Nayar shader is quite similar to the Lambert shader, but contains an additional control called roughness. Increasing the roughness tends to scatter the diffuse light, making it more even across the non-shadowed areas. I'll render this with a roughness setting of 1.3. With the roughness setting at 0, the Oren-Nayar shader is much the same as the Lambert shader. The next diffuse shader is the Toon shader. The Toon shader mimics a cartoon cell type of coloring, where there is a distinct boundary between light and shadow. Further, there's little gradation in the colored or the shadowed area of the rendering. Here is the rendering of the default settings. There are 2 additional controls for the Toon Diffuse shader, one called Size, which controls the size of the colored area in comparison to the size of the shadow area, and Smooth, which creates a gradation between the colored and smooth shadowed areas. Here I will set the size at 0.5 and set the smooth at 0.5, and then re-render the scene. The next diffuse shader is called Minart. Minart shader is sometimes referred to as the Moon shader. It contains a darkness control that by default is set to 1. At this setting, it's almost identical to the Lambert shader. However, lowering the darkness increases the brightness of the outline of the rendered object with no regard for the position of the light source. Here I will render the scene with the Minart diffuse darkness set at 0. Notice the bright rim on the sphere. Increasing the darkness setting past 1 creates a dark spot in the center of the object facing the camera. Here I will render the scene with the Menard diffuse darkness set at 2. The last diffuse shader is called Fresnel. The Fresnel shader acts in direct opposition to the light source. Parts of the object that face the light source are darkened, and parts of the object that face away from the light source are lightened. In effect, the Fresnel diffuse shader bends the light to the side, much like a Fresnel lens. Here I will set the Fresnel setting to 1 and the factor setting to 2 and render the scene. I'll set the diffuse shader back to Lambert with the intensity of the default 0.8. The specular shader controls are located below the diffuse shader controls. The default specular shader is called Cook Torrents, but there are 5 different specular shaders available by clicking on the specular shader drop-down box. In addition to Cook Torrents, there's Phong, Blinn, Tune, and Ward ISO. The default Cook Torrent specular shader is a very good all-purpose specular shader. It's particularly good at creating the shiny types of specular reflection like those found in plastics. It has 2 controllers, intensity and hardness. The intensity slider controls the amount of brightness of the specular reflection, while the hardness slider controls the hardness of the edge of the specular reflection. You can see in the preview panel that as I increase the hardness setting, the specular reflection becomes more concentrated and hard-edged. I'll set the intensity to 1 and the hardness to 300 and render the scene. You can see that the effect is to make the object appear more shiny and plastic. Note also that the color of the specular reflection is also adjustable. By default it's set to white, but the specular reflector color can be adjusted by clicking on the specular color swatch and adjusting the color just as we did the diffuse color. Here I will make the specular color cooler by reducing the amount of red. I'll return the specular color to white. The next type of specular shader is called Phong. The Phong shader is quite similar to the Cook Torrents shader, as it also contains a setting for both intensity and hardness. Now I see little difference between these 2 specular shaders, but the Blender Wiki describes the Phong shader as being better for skin or other organic surfaces. The next specular shader is called Blinn. The Blinn shader adds a 3rd controller called IOR, which is an index of refraction control. It further controls the intensity of the highlight. I'll set the intensity at 1 and the hardness at 300 and the IOR at 9 and render the scene. This produces a very tight, hard-edged specular reflection, similar to what you might find with some ceramic objects. The next specular shader is called Tune, and it controls the specular highlight in much the same way that the Tune diffuse shader controls the diffuse color. It creates a very sharp contrast and an even specular field. It's used frequently in combination with the diffuse Tune shader. The final specular shader is called Ward ISO, which in addition to the intensity controller has a slider called Slope. The slope controller is somewhat like a hardness and IOR controller wrapped into one. It allows for a large amount of control over the intensity, hardness, and softness of the specular highlight. Here's a rendering with the intensity at 1 and the slope at 0.4. Here's a rendering with the intensity at 1 and the slope at 0.1. This is a good specular shader for metallic objects. I'll reset the specular shader to Cook Torrents with a default intensity of 0.5 and the default hardness of 50. One additional set of shading controls is located in the shading panel directly below the specular shader. It is possible to bypass the diffuse and specular shaders by checkmarking the Shadeless checkbox. This removes all the shader effect and displays a full, bright, ungradiated color. Here I will render the sphere with the Shadeless box checked. I'll uncheck the Shadeless checkbox. Another setting in the shading panel is the Emit controller. Increasing this value produces the effect that the object itself is emitting light. Here I will set the emit level to 1.5 and render. The emit setting is a good starting point for developing materials that emit their own light. It takes time, practice, and patience to begin to understand the subtle variation in the various shader settings and their effect on the rendered object. The best way to learn how to effectively use Blender shaders is to both experiment on your own and see how others have used the shaders to affect real-world surfaces. One of the best resources for this is the Blender Open Material Repository. This repository contains hundreds of materials that will provide an excellent jumping-off point for learning how to use Blender shaders. A link to the Blender Material Repository and other Blender material examples are located on our course site.